Awesome. Can see that participant number is still climbing, so I'll just ramble and waffle for another 15 seconds or so to let any people finish joining. But first things first, welcome everybody and welcome back to everyone who was here yesterday. Really nice to see so many of you back after yesterday's session. Ed clearly didn't scare you off, and you're ready for round two of some more coding today. So we're really excited. Again, we're just super thrilled, super humbled to have so many people that are giving up their week to spend with us to learn to code. And yeah, we're really thrilled that you're here. We really hope you're getting a lot of value out of these sessions, and we're really excited to continue this coding journey with you. So let's kick off with a very short introduction from me. Maybe actually a quick whip round of who's in the room today. So my name is Patrick and I work for Boolean UK. Helping out with basically anything that isn't directly teaching. Don't ask me anything about coding because I do not know. And today I'm joined by Ed, if you want to say two words.
Hi folks, my name is Ed, as Patrick said. I do everything that is not what Patrick does. All of the teaching responsible for it here at Boolean UK. Supported very ably by Nathan, one of our teachers. Nathan, do you want to give a quick introduction of yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Nathan. I'm one of the teachers, like Ed says, and I'm going to be running the session today.
Fantastic.
I think my internet was going slightly dodgy. I'm going to see if I can get through these 2-3 slides that I've got, but apologies if it breaks through.
And on that note, he's frozen.
They're very descriptive.
You're back again, Patrick.
I'm back.
Yeah.
Are we working? We good?
Yes.
Sweet.
Every time you say that, then it stops again slightly.
Maybe not.
Do you want me to talk through the slides, or do you want to try?
Ed, yeah, you go through these slides. That's a good idea.
Cool. So yesterday, folks, we had an introduction to HTML and CSS. This is a really useful recording to go have a look at. I'm trying to share it with everyone who asks, but if you check your emails, anyone who attended yesterday, it's available. But also, I'm going to send out a link in the chat that you should have access to. It's disabled in terms of you being able to use it, but you should still receive it. So if you look in the Zoom chat and go to that in your Zoom window, you should see a link that I've sent to everyone. If you click here, you'll be able to access the recording from the first session. So click to the first session that we did on HTML and CSS, and you'll be able to see that recording we did yesterday. Every day we'll upload the recordings. So no matter if you attend or not, you can share these. These are all free public resources that you can take advantage of. And we'll upload it by around lunchtime every day. So that's what we did yesterday, HTML and CSS. Today is all about JavaScript, the introduction to JavaScript and how it manipulates the web page. It'll be run by fantastic Nathan. Tomorrow, we're going to set up your first web game using JavaScript, HTML and CSS, all the three things you've done yesterday and today. Tic-tac-toe, it'll be pretty fun. Then you have an open day. A chance to be able to learn a little bit more about Boolean and the courses if you're interested in joining us. It'll be a really great event to attend. I'll be there as well. You can ask any questions whatsoever about the education, the learning, starting things like that happen here. And then on Friday, we finish with Space Invaders, and I'll be running that session, building it from scratch. So that's what we're going to be doing this week from 5 to 7 p.m. And let us know how it goes. Ask questions and fill out the forms. And we're trying to keep it very interactive as much as possible. On the slide in front of you, you can see you have a couple of different options if you're interested in joining us to start your journey as a tech professional. You can study with us to do full stack software development. You can just do front-end development, part of our course. You can join us to study data analytics. All of our courses, as you can see, we do remotely live using Discord and Zoom and a few other tools. And we'll support you for 6 months afterwards in your ability to get a job. But the main thing here, you'll learn a lot more about this if you're interested on Thursday evening at 5 p.m. here UK time, 5 to about 6:30 p.m. Attend, it's going to be fun. We'll have a few students they'll be able to talk to you about what it's like to be a student here and get to know a little bit about the day-to-day. 4 points, just to keep in mind. I think Nathan's going to cover these things again, so I won't belabor the point here. But one of the most important things is, as I said, the recordings will always be available to you the day after. So importantly, watch it back if you ever want to go back through the things that we're talking about. And the main point is take it easy. You don't need to feel like you have to follow and keep up and writing all the code at the same time. Watch and observe and try and just reason about things as we go along. What we do in these sessions is probably about a condensed week worth of content. So not really expecting you to have to be able to follow, but the main thing is dabble if you want, and then watch the recording back and play around with it and see if there's something that interests you. And the main thing here is like showing what you're able to do with just these simple tools to build some web games by the end of this week. You'll get a certificate if you complete this week. Come to all the lessons. We'll share some forms with you to fill out every day, so you'll be able to show us that you've attended. Jump in with questions. We will pause for questions as we go through the session today. But otherwise, let's go on to the next slide.
That's actually it.
That's it. Awesome. So I'm going to hand over to Nathan in a second. Thanks, Patrick, for the slides and being able to click through to the next one. And have I missed anything else out?
No, I think the only thing is, obviously, I know we had so many of you attend yesterday that we reached a max capacity. So if you are looking for the certificate, don't worry about yesterday's attendance. We're not going to count that towards the certificate. So we'll be sending out the form about halfway through today's session. So look out for that form about halfway through today, and again at the end for you to fill in for today's session.
Amazing. Okay, over to you, Nathan.
Okay, thanks, guys. All right, so I want to start just by setting some expectations for the session, what we're going to cover. So we're going to cover all of the fundamental concepts that we're going to need in order to build tic-tac-toe and Space Invaders towards the end of the week. Ed's already touched on this, but it is a lot of content that we're having to condense down into 2 hours. So don't feel like you have to keep up. There's going to be times where you feel a little bit confused. That's totally normal. We're going to explore a debugging technique that developers use pretty much all the time, every few minutes, I would say. It's a very regular thing. And that's going to help us get some visibility on what our code is actually doing, rather than just making assumptions that we've got it right, and then we find out we've got bugs. Later on in the session, towards the end, the latter half, we're going to be using the JavaScript that we learned to actually manipulate a HTML web page. So things like changing some text size, adding some styles, changing some colors, clicking some stuff. And the purpose of this really is to just demystify programming, right? It's not some magical, mysterious skill that only mathematicians or scientists or Elon Musk can learn. I've been doing this for around about 12 years. And before that, I was a working musician and then a chef. And I'm not very good at maths. Ed can probably agree with this. I'm not very good at maths, but I'm pretty good with logic. And that's really all it takes. Just take some time to think about things. It's a very creative field. Once again, it's 2 hours. There's a lot of information. Do not expect to go out of the 2 hours building the next Facebook or the next Discord. Not going to happen. You're just in for a bad time if that's what you're here for. All right, so what is a programming language? You can think of it just like a normal written or spoken language. So we use a spoken language like English or German or French to communicate with humans, right? A programming language is essentially just a language that we use to communicate with a computer. So we will give a computer a list of instructions that it needs to run through, and then give us back some kind of response. So if we take, for example, the Facebook login experience, we can program some software to have a user input a username and password, and then the programming language can run through some instructions, verify their email is correct, verify their password is correct. If it is, let the user log in, show them a news feed. And we can kind of visualize that here. So we give the computer some input instructions, it does some stuff, and then it outputs some kind of result. This is how it used to happen. So it's become a lot more accessible in recent years. Way back when, in the 1970s, people would have to punch holes in cards in a certain specific sequence, and that would make a machine do a task in a specific order. Not very user-friendly. You did have to be pretty good with maths back in these days, but we've made it much more user-friendly these days. Pretty much anyone can pick it up now. We have laptops, we have the internet. We're in for a much better time. The language we're going to focus on today is JavaScript. There are a lot of languages out there, thousands, and you've probably heard of some like C++ or Python or other things like that. JavaScript is everywhere. So if you learn JavaScript, and it's a relatively easy language to pick up, if you learn JavaScript, there are plenty of jobs out there. There are really good salaries. You will get a job. It's in everything: toasters, spaceships, web apps, apps on your phone. A lot of those are built with JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. So all the skills that we teach are very, very relevant. The last slide I have here before we get into the actual activity is just a little visualization of what the development process looks like for a developer. So a lot of mistakes that beginners will make right in the beginning is they'll write a bunch of code, they'll write like 100 lines of code, and then they'll run their application, everything will crash, and things will just go wrong. They've made a mistake on line number 5 way back in the beginning, and it's just riddled with errors. We don't do that. So we'll write a little bit of code. We'll write 2, 3, maybe 4 lines. Then we'll stop and we'll run our software. We'll predict what it's going to do. And then we'll verify that we got it right. If we didn't get it right, we'll change the code. We'll fix it. Then we'll predict the outcome again. Then we'll verify it. And it's just an endless cycle like that. This is actually really rewarding to work in this way because you get a lot of rewards throughout the day. Every few minutes, you're getting rewarded for being right about something. Just a little bit of magic there. All right, so the easiest way for you to follow along today is by using Code Sandbox. So if you go to codesandbox.io, or you can search for Code Sandbox in your browser, it will be the top result. On their homepage, they have a little create sandbox button in the top right-hand corner over here. So you can just click that. You're going to be presented with a list of templates to choose from, right? React, Vanilla, Angular, all this stuff. The template you want is static, the one with the orange shield with the 5 in it. That's the one you should be using. And then you should be presented with a screen that looks like this. On the left-hand side, you have a list of files. In the middle, you have your code editor. On the right-hand side, you have what the web page looks like. You can ignore the file package.json. You could ignore sandbox.config.json. What we need is index.html, and we need a couple of others. So over here on the left-hand side here, there's a little menu at the top, a down arrow, an up arrow, and a page. You're going to click the page, and you're going to create a file and call it index.js. So we're going to need that. And then we're going to create another file called style.css. Okay, these are the 3 files we're going to need today. Once you have those, you're all ready to go. On the right-hand side, you'll see the web page. What you can do is down at the bottom, you'll see a little console button. You're going to click that console just to bring up this little black box. We're going to leave this open because most of the stuff we do is going to be visible in this console. That's where most of our results are going to be. Ed is going to share a link in the chat to this snippet of HTML. So everyone can feel free, once Ed shared the link in the Zoom chat, to just copy this HTML and bring it into their code sandbox and replace the HTML that was in there before. That's going to get us set up. Okay. So I'm going to do the first thing we're going to touch on in Code Sandbox so you can see how we run things. And then I'm going to switch to my actual coding environment. So we have this HTML here. We're not going to touch HTML for a good while yet. Most of the things we're going to do is in index.js. We want the index.js file. Should be empty. Now, the first thing that I want to just introduce you to in our code, oftentimes we want to leave ourselves notes. We write code for other people, not just ourselves, and sometimes code can be quite complex. So it can be handy to leave some notes for other developers. Let me just increase the size of this over here. So you can create a note or a comment by doing 2 forward slashes, and then you can write whatever you want, okay? Just leave yourself a little message there. When your code runs, this will not be executed. This will not appear on the screen. It will not appear in a console. It will just, it's like it doesn't exist. But it's a handy little way for developers to just leave notes for each other. And we're going to start writing some JavaScript by sticking to the tradition of developers and doing hello world. So the way we're going to do that is by using something called a console log. And this is a very common tool that we use all the time. It's one of the best debugging tools out there. So what we're going to do is we're going to write the word console, all lowercase, and then a period or a dot, and then the word log. And then we're going to add an opening and a closing parentheses, bracket, whatever you want to call it. Inside these parentheses, we're going to write a little message for ourselves. So what we want to do is we want to add some double quotations. And inside these double quotations, we're going to write the words, hello world, okay? If you save this file on Windows, that's Control S. On Mac, I believe it's Command S. You will see things change a little bit, and you will see hello world over here in the console. And that's our first application. We've created some code, and we've run it. We've had no errors, success. Now this right here in the double quotations, this is called a string, okay? This is one of the data types we deal with. A string is essentially characters, a sentence, a word, anything like that. And we create a string by using quotations. Now we can also deal with numbers. So I'm going to stick to my plan here, and I'm going to switch to my actual environment. I'm going to stick hello world in here. And for anybody that's following along on in a browser with a local editor, if you want to bring up the developer tool console, you can right-click in the HTML file, hit the inspect. It might be DevTools, it might be inspector. Mine says inspect. That's going to bring up a big DevTools window on the side here. I'm going to click the console tab, and this is where all of my outputs are going to be. This is the same thing as encode sandbox over here. So this is a string. Now we can also deal with numbers, and they follow the same rules as in real life maths. So if we do another console.log, you're going to get a lot of practice writing console.log. We can stick any old number in here. I'm going to go with 42, the answer to everything. And if we go back to our page, we'll see that in the console. So we have our hello world. We have the number 42. We can deal with fractions as well. So we can add a console log and do something like 42.781. And we'll get this in the console as well. Now, because we can deal with numbers in programming languages, we can obviously deal with math operations. This is the bit that scares a lot of people off, but don't worry. Most of the time, all of the math you're going to need is just basic add, subtract, divide, and multiply. So let's run through the operations here. The first two are going to be pretty obvious. So if we console log out 5 plus 2, and we'll see in the console we get 7, right? So we've created a little calculator here. I can console log out, let's say 10 minus 6, and I'm going to get 4, right? Now, the next two symbols are a little bit different to what they are when they're written down. So I'm going to console log out a division. So I'm going to take 12 and I'm going to divide 12 by 2. Now, the symbol for dividing is a /. So 12 divided by 2, that's our division. That's going to give me 6. And then if we want to do some multiply, we can take any number. Let's go with 3. And to multiply something, we use an asterisk or a star. On my keyboard, that is the one just above 8. 3 times 6, 18. Now notice we've got all of these logs on top of each other. So it's probably a good thing to point out that code will run line by line, right? So this will run first, it will print that to the console. The next one will run straight after, that will print to the console. So it's always in the order that you write it, right? At least in the way we're writing code right now. There are a couple of other data types that I want to introduce. So the next one I want to talk about is our namesake. So Booleans. Booleans are true and false, and you can think about these as an on-off switch. So if you think about binary, binary is a sequence of 1s and 0s. 1 represents true, 0 represents false. A light switch is either on or it's off, it's true or it's false. So we can add a console log here, and all lowercase again, we can just write the word true. Check out our console and we get that here. And then we can do the same thing for false. Fantastic. These aren't too useful by themselves, right? We rarely just use a Boolean for no reason whatsoever. Where these come in handy is deciding how our application should run, depending on whether something is true or false. So we ask our code questions a lot of the time. We can take, for example, a user entering their login details into Facebook. Is their password correct? If it is, if that's true, let them log in, show them a newsfeed. If it's wrong, if it's false, show them an error message. We will get into conditional statements like that during this session. The last data type I want to introduce you to is emptiness, no value, nothingness. We can represent that in code using the word null. If something has a null value, it has nothingness. It's empty. It's the void. And we see that here. All right, so those are the main data types we're going to be dealing with. We do have a couple of others that we will get to shortly, but I'm going to move on to something called variables. Once I've gone through variables, we'll stop for a little bit and start asking some questions. So let me bring up my next file here. Okay, so variables. We want to reuse things in code a lot of the time. So if I was to write here a console log for hello world, and then somewhere else in my code later on, I wanted to do the same thing using the same string, but I made a typo. I've missed an L off hello, right? The code doesn't care. Code will do exactly what we tell it to do. It's very, very literal. So it will not assume that I wanted to spell hello. It will do exactly what I tell it to do. So if I want to reuse this value later, this string later on, I'm going to want to save it somewhere, right? I'm going to want to add a label to the value so I can reference it later. I want to take this value, put it in a box somewhere, put a label on the box, just so I can get that back when I need to. The way we can do this is by using variables. And there's a couple of ways that we can do this. The first is by using a keyword called const, which is all lowercase. So it's C-O-N-S-T. And then you want a name for the variable. So a label for your value. I'm going to call this my first variable. And then I'm going to use an equals sign. So this is where I'm assigning a value to this label. And I'm going to put hello world right here. And this is a variable in JavaScript. What this means is now that I can do console.log, my first variable, instead of typing the string in here, I can pass the variable in. I can pass the label for the string. I've got something that I can reference. And now it doesn't matter how many times I run this console log, I know that every single time I'm always going to get this exact value. There's going to be no typos in my console. Every single one of them is the same, which is super useful. We'll be dealing with variables a lot. So after we've created a variable, there might be times where we want to change its value. Maybe I want to change this to goodbye world. So if I want to change a variable, I don't need the const keyword anymore. All I can do is just use the name of the variable, whatever I've called it, and you can name it whatever you want. This could be banana if I wanted it to. So you just need the name of the variable, then an equal sign, and then some kind of new value for it. I'm going to say goodbye world. I'm going to console log this out again. And we're going to encounter our first error here. Type error, assignment to a constant variable. So the const keyword will create a variable that cannot be changed after you've created it. So this variable right here, my first variable, always has to have this value. It will always be hello world for the entire lifespan of the application. When I tried to change it down here, JavaScript says, no, you're not allowed to do that. And then it's going to stop my application from running and give me some kind of message. Now, if I want to be able to change the value of a variable, I don't use the const keyword. I'm going to comment out this line of code. I'm going to stick it again down here. There is another declaration word we can use for creating a variable that we want to change later. And that's called let. Okay. So we use the word const when we want to create something that we don't want to change later, that we want to stay as one value. We use let when we want to create a variable that might change at some point in the future. Depending on the situation in your software, you're going to use both of these fairly often. So now if I run this code in my browser, I get hello world, and then I've changed it to goodbye world, and that's what I get in the browser. Great. So these are my first two variables, my first one variable. We can also store the result of some kind of evaluation into a variable. So for example, a math operation like 1 + 2, we can store the result of that into a variable. So 1 + 2 is 3. We can save that into some kind of variable that we want. I'll just call this my result, and I'm just going to say 1 + 2. And the result of this math operation is going to be saved in this my result variable. So I can console log this out, my result. Head back to my browser, and I'm going to see 3 in here. I'm going to change these numbers a bit, make them a bit bigger. I'm going to say 10 + 23, and I'm going to get 33. This is where something kind of similar to algebra might come in, right? It's a scary word, but it's really, it shouldn't be. Algebra is essentially just giving a label to a number that you don't know the value of yet. So if we think back to school, we may have had something like a + b equals something else. In programming, that's just variables, right? So we can create a variable called a. We can assign it a value of 5. We can create a variable called b and give it a value of 10. And then we can console log out a plus b, right? So this is essentially saying a, which is 5, plus b, which is 10. So we're going to get 15 in our console over here. And this is very useful. This is going to come in handy later. We can also store this into a new variable. So I can create another variable down here. I'll call this one my other result. And the value of that is going to be a plus b. And then I can console log that variable out. And we still get 15 in here. Okay. We've got a couple of more things to go through, and then we'll have a little time for questions. So the next thing I want to talk about is joining strings together. So we call this string concatenation. Probably the finest example here is we usually have a first name and a last name. My first name is Nathan, my last name is King. If you've ever filled in any kind of registration form on a website before, you probably noticed that they'll have a separate field for both of those. So you'll enter your first name into an input field, and you'll enter your last name into a different input field. But when you actually log into the website, it may display your name as your full name. It may say, welcome, Nathan King. So this is essentially how we're going to do that. So I'm going to create a constant variable. I'm going to call this first name. And that's going to be equal to Nathan. I'm going to create another variable called last name. That's going to be equal to King. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw a console log down here, and I'm going to say first name. And then I'm going to use the plus symbol. So just like we can add two numbers together, we can add two strings together. The operation's a bit different. So when they're numbers, it adds them together as a math operation. When they're strings, it joins them together, like a bit of glue. So we can do first name plus last name. Now this is going to give me Nathan King with no space in the middle. Once again, computers are very literate and they will do exactly what you tell them to do. I've not added any space into these strings here, so it's just going to join them together, and it's not going to assume that I want any space in between. If I want to add space in between, I can join more than two strings together, right? So I can chain this on as many times as I want. I can do first name plus some a string and just add a space into that. And then I can do another plus here. So I end up with first name plus some quotes with an empty space in between, plus my last name. And that's going to give me Nathan King with my space. So this is how websites might do that kind of thing. Another method for doing this is called string interpolation. You don't have to remember the names of these things. We cover them extensively in the course. So string interpolation is probably what you would use if you had a longer string. If you wanted to construct maybe a greeting message, maybe you had a paragraph and you wanted to insert some variables values into those. You probably don't want to do a bunch of variables plus another variable plus another variable just like 10 times. That would be very difficult to read. So what we can do instead is I'm going to create another variable. I'm going to call this greeting. I'm going to use my equals sign. And instead of double quotations or single quotations, I'm going to use backticks. Backticks are right underneath the escape key on your keyboard and right above the tab key, usually. I'm going to need two of those, and inside these backticks is where I'm going to put my string. So I'm going to say, hello there, my name is, and then I'm just going to do first name here. Okay, so this is my string. And I'm going to console log this out. I'm going to console log out my greeting string. And I get, hello there, my name is first name, which is probably not what I want. Computers are very literate, And it's not going to assume that I want to put this variable into my string unless I give it some syntax to tell it that's what I want to do. If I want to insert some variable's value into this string, I need to use some syntax that looks like this. I'm going to use a $, and then an opening curly bracket, and then a closing curly bracket around the variable that I want to insert. Okay, so this is essentially nullifying the need for us to type plus. We can just write out our string and then replace some things in there with this syntax right here. A $, opening curly brace, the name of the variable you want to insert, and then a closing curly brace. And then I get, hello there, my name is Nathan. And I can do that as many times as I want in the same string. I can do the same thing with my last name variable. Hello there, my name is Nathan King. Nice. Do we have some questions, Ed?
Nice. Yes, we have some questions. The first one is, what's the name of that app with the lion logo that you use for your browser?
Excellent. Fantastic question. So this is Brave browser. This works on the Chromium engine. So it's exactly the same as Google Chrome, except it doesn't have any of the privacy invasion. They've taken all of the privacy invasion out of it and made it very suitable for people that are interested in cryptocurrencies or just getting back their right of privacy. Thoroughly recommend it. It's got a built-in ad blocker. It blocks any websites from tracking you. I definitely recommend you switch to it if need be, if you'd like to. Because it's built on the Chrome engine, it will work with pretty much any website. Great question.
Good. Would you mind doing another short repeat of right at the very beginning, setting up the code sandbox? Maybe go open up a new private tab and just show how you copied across the HTML. I think a few people wanted to see that demonstrated again.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to go to codesandbox.io. And in the top right-hand corner here, I've got a Create Sandbox button. I'm going to click that button, and I'm going to get this. This is giving me a different one this time.
Cool. Create Sandbox.
Yep. I'm going to click the Create Sandbox button, and I'm going to get this little set of options. So the template that I want here is this static template. I'm going to click on this static template, the one with the orange shield. That's going to give me a brand new sandbox environment. I'm going to create a couple of files by going up here in the top left-hand corner. We've got an up arrow, a down arrow. We've got a little page icon. I'm going to click the page icon, and I'm going to create a new file called index.js. And again, I'm going to create another one called style.css. I'm going to open up the index.html file. I'm going to go to the link that Ed shared in the Zoom chat, and I'm just going to copy this HTML. And I'm just going to paste it all into here.
Nice.
The last thing you want to do here is in the bottom right-hand corner, click on this little console button to bring up the console. And
would you mind demonstrating a console log statement here so we can see it in the console?
Absolutely, yeah. So left-hand side, I'm going to double click on the index.js file that I created. I'm just going to do a little console.log code sandbox, and I get that over here.
Cool. Thank you for that. Another question that we have is, Nathan has so many games. What are your favorites?
Great question. I'm a big fan of role-playing fantasy games. So I like things like Pathfinder, Dungeons and Dragons, Baldur's Gate, the Elder Scrolls series, Skyrim, Morrowind. I love all that kind of stuff.
Amazing. I think someone said they were inspired by your Morrowind. Okay, one more question. Can you go back and do the interpolation for first name again? I think it was on line 28. So can you repeat that process?
I will repeat that process. Absolutely. So if we don't want to chain on a bunch of pluses when we want to construct a string, we can use string interpolation. So I'm going to create a new variable here. I'll call it greeting, use my equals sign to assign a value to the variable. I'm going to use backticks. Now, backticks are one down from the escape key or one up from the tab key on your keyboard usually. And then this is going to function like a normal string. So I can stick a message in here. Hi, my name is something. And instead of writing my name in here, I've already got this data saved into a first name variable, right? So I don't want to type this out. I might spell my name wrong. I might change the casing by accident. Must be drunk. What I want to do is just insert the value of this variable into this string. So the way I'm going to do that is by using a $sign. So that's usually shift and then the 4 key, at least on my keyboard. And then I'm going to do an opening curly brace and a closing curly brace. Inside those curly braces, I'm going to stick the name of my variable. So first name. Hi, my name is $sign opening curly brace, the name of the variable, and then a closing curly brace. I'm going to console log that out. Head to my browser. And here we get it in the console.
Nice.
All right. Let's move on. Let's move on to our next data type.
Nice.
So we're going to talk a little bit about arrays. So let me just open up my other file here. Bring up my new window, open my DevTools, bring up the console. Fantastic. So we've already covered creating singular things as variables, names and numbers, things like that. Very often we want lists of things. So we can think of in the real world, we might create a shopping list before we go to the supermarket, right? And that shopping list will contain multiple strings. You'll have bread, milk, coffee, vodka, maybe. It's a list of items, and we can represent that in code using something called an array. So this is an array, a list of things. We do the same syntax as we do with variables. So I'm going to use const. You can use let as well if you want to, but I'm going to use const. I'm going to give this a name. So I'm going to say shopping list. An equals sign, and then I'm going to use square brackets. So square brackets is the syntax that we use for creating arrays, creating lists. Opening square bracket, closing square bracket, and inside those brackets is where I'm going to put my individual items. So if I'm going to put some strings in here, I'm going to do my double quotations, or my single quotations, or my backticks. I'm going to say bread. And then after the closing quotation, I'm going to add a comma because I want to add a second thing. And I'm going to say milk. And then I'm going to do the same thing, add a comma and add coffee. So I've got a list of 3 things. And I'm going to add a console log here, and I'm just going to console log out the name of the variable, which I've called shopping list. Head to my browser, and I can see this in the console now. I've got the number 3 here. So the console is telling me how big my list is. It's telling me how many things are in my list. And then it's listing the actual things that are in it. Now, if I click this, this is going to expand the view a little bit, and things get a little bit more complex here. But let me just touch on this briefly. An array, a list of things, has something under the hood called an index. An index is basically an identifier for a position in the list, right? So there is position 0, 1, and 2 in this list. Arrays start from 0. In every programming language, arrays always start at index 0, not 1. So the thing at index number 0 is the first item in the array. We can see bread here is at index number 0. The thing at index number 1 is milk, which is the second item in the array. The thing at index number 2 is coffee. This one trips developers up sometimes. If I want to access a specific thing in this list, I can use the index to do that. So I'm going to add another console log here. And if I say I want to just log out the first item in the list, I'm going to need index 0. So I'm going to do the name of the variable. I'm going to add some opening and closing square brackets. And inside these square brackets is where I'm going to put the index number. So if I want the first item in this list, knowing that arrays start from index 0, I'm going to put the number 0 in here. Head back to my browser, and this is going to give me bread. If I change this 0 to a 1, index number 1, I'm going to get milk. And then the same thing with index number 3 is, that's undefined. Index number 2, I've just said that trips developers up sometimes, and then it tripped me up. Just to demonstrate the point. Index number 2 is coffee. So there are 3 things in the list, but the index start from 0. So 0, 1, 2. The last index in the array is always going to be the length of the array minus 1, which can be useful sometimes. Let me just add a comment here for accessing an item by its index. Great. Now we can store anything inside of an array. We can store strings. We can store numbers. 3, 7, 21, 42. I'm going to log that out, and we get an array filled with numbers. We can have an array filled with Booleans, an array filled with null, an array filled with arrays, but we won't get into that on this session. It can be very useful sometimes to know the length of an array. Sometimes you will need to know how long an array is, how big your list is. And we can do that by, I'm going to add a console log here, and I'm going to do the name of my shopping list. So my shopping list variable, which I know is an array, and I'm going to do dot and then the word length, all lowercase. This is going to give me the length of my shopping list, which is 3. If I add something else in here, I also want t. This is going to update to 4. Get the length of my list. Fantastic. Okay, let's move on to another data type, and then we'll stop again for questions. Let me just open up my new file here. Open up my new window, open my DevTools. All right, so we've discussed lists of things. There is also another thing that we need to talk about, which is called objects. So there may be situations where we have a whole bunch of variables that should be kind of grouped together. So if we take, for example, we want to represent myself in code. Let's just give me a name of Nathan. And then let's give me a favorite color. My favorite color is purple. That should do. Now, what if I want to also create some code to represent Ed? I'm going to create a const, and I'm going to try and call this name and give it the value Ed. And I'm going to create another one called favorite color, and I'm going to assume this is total wild guess, but I'm just going to say that Ed's favorite color is wild pink. Let's go with hot pink, really bright hot pink.
Accurate.
Yes, excellent. I thought so. I'm going to go back to my browser, and I've got an error message here. Identifier name has already been declared. I've already used this variable name. I cannot use this variable name more than one time. So here we're in a conundrum. We've got 2 blocks of very relevant code. that are two variables that are related to each other, trying to represent two different people. So we can group these values into a separate thing. So instead of having separate variables here, I can create what's called an object. Now, an object is just a thing that represents something that has multiple attributes. We can think of an object like a person that has a name, a profession, an eye color, that sort of thing, or a table that has a material, a number of legs, a height, and a width. So I'm going to create a constant called Nathan. I'm going to use the equal sign, and then I'm going to use some curly braces, opening curly braces and closing curly brace. Inside these opening and curly brackets or braces, this is where I can add my actual keys and values, okay, so my variables. Now, the way we create these is slightly different to the way we do it down here. We don't use the equal sign. Instead, what we do is the name of the attribute or the property or the variable, if you want to call it that. And then we use a colon, and then we do the value. So Nathan has a name attribute, a name property, and a colon, and then the value of that property is Nathan. I'm going to add a comma on the end, just like I do with multiple items in an array. I want multiple properties on my object. And then I'm going to add my fav color property, and I'm going to say purple. Now I'm going to add another one. I'm going to call this one Ed, and I'm going to do the same thing here. So we have Ed, whose favorite color is hot pink. I'm going to console log both of these objects out. So we've got Nathan, and we have Ed. And we can see these in the console. So even though these two objects have the same attributes on them, a name and a favorite color, they don't interact with each other. They no longer conflict. I've grouped my values into some logical situation, into some logical package that I can use later. Now, if I want to get just one of the specific values from one of these objects, I can use very similar syntax to what we've been doing, right? So I can do a, let me get rid of these. I can do a console log and say I just want to console log out Ed's favorite color. We'll focus on Ed's favorite color. So I can do the name of my variable, which is Ed. Then I'm going to say dot, or period, and then I'm going to do the name of the property, fav color. I'm going to head back to my console and I see hot pink. So this is how we can group things together and use those things that we've grouped. I can say Nathan.name, and that gives me Nathan. Now, if I want to add something to an object later on in my code, I can do that too, right? So neither of these people have a profession. So let's give them a profession. Somewhere down here, I'm going to add a property to these objects. The way I can do that is by simply saying the object's name, so the name of the variable, dot, and then I want to come up with a name for the attribute I want to add to the object. I'm going to call it profession. I'm going to use an equal sign, and I'm going to give it a string. And we'll just say software dev. Now, if I console log out Nathan again, I will see in my browser that we have a whole new different object. We've got Nathan as his name, fav color of purple, and a profession of software dev. There really is no limit to the amount of attributes you can add to an object. It's really only limited by the memory on your machine. It's incredibly unlikely you will ever create an object big enough to even come close to that number. So you can go nuts. You can create big objects. We all do it. The next thing I want to do is I want to add a, touching on that question I was asked earlier, I want to add another property to my object, which contains a list of things. So I'm going to add a list of favorite games to Nathan. I'm going to do Nathan.favgames. And I'm going to say equals square brackets, opening and closing square brackets. And then we're going to say Pathfinder and Baldur's Gate. Now I can console log that out, Nathan.favegames. And we'll see we get that in this console here. If I take off this fave games and just go back here, I'll see that I've got this object. Fave color purple, fave games is an array of things. So I've attached a list to an object. You can use them both together. I think that's all we need to cover for objects. So before we get into the deep stuff, which is going to cause some confusion, let's stop again for questions for a few minutes.
Okay, nice stuff. I've been furiously typing away, doing my best. We've got loads of questions, so we've got about 200 open questions. A lot of the questions are just about trying to use sandbox and save things and see things happen. So I think we've already demonstrated that, so I'm not going to go back and ask you to do that again, Nathan. So let me try and find some more interesting questions. We have a question here about what the difference is between the single quotes and double quotes, and then again, what about the backticks? Could you explain again what the difference is between these three things?
Yeah, great question. Let's find out. So I'm going to just create a little variable here, and I'm going to call it, I don't know, hobby. And we'll just call it coding, and I'm going to use double quotations here. Because I've used double quotation, I can use apostrophes inside of this string, right? So I can add single quotes inside of this string and it's not going to mess with anything. Coding's great. Let's change this to message. Console log this out. Go to my console and I see coding's great. Fantastic. If I was to then change this to single quotations, we'll see some errors starting to happen, right? If I go back to my console, I'm getting some error messages. That's because I've essentially ended the string here. I've said coding, and then it's reached another single quote, and then anything that comes after that is just invalid code at that point. So that's really the main difference where I would use single quotations versus double quotations. If I'm using apostrophes in my string, I'm going to use double quotations. There are other ways around it, but we'll not go into those.
Nice. Mm-hmm.
And just to touch on backticks, the only time you would really use the backticks is if you want to throw a variable into here, right? So Nathan.name, for example. That's the only time you'd really use the backticks if you want to do some string interpolation. Totally fine if you want to create strings with backticks. Nobody's going to really call you up on it. Doesn't really matter too much.
Cool. Next question is about objects and properties. Can you take the scroll down, Nathan? Let's use Nathan. And can you show how you would change the profession property to point to a different value, for example, essentially Absolutely, updating Nathan?
So let's get rid of this stuff here. So I've created my profession for Nathan. Just have a look in the console and I've got that here, profession software dev. And then later on down the line, maybe he gets a different job. Maybe he's between things. Please don't fire me, Ed. All I need to do here is the exact same thing, right? So Nathan.profession equals something else. Let's say I go back to being a chef, which I really don't want to do. And I'm going to log out Nathan again. And now we'll see in the console that we have Nathan logged up here as a chef. And let's change both of them. That's, yes, okay. That's weird. It's giving me software dev here, but when I expand it, it's giving me chef. That's pretty weird. We'll just collapse them. So we see the object here with name, fave, color, and profession software dev. And then the other object down here where the profession is changed to chef. The way I did that was just by using the exact same syntax.
There might just be the just-in-time evaluation in the browser console. It probably keeps the pointer to the old value. When you expand it, it shows the new value. Awesome. Thank you for that. Any more useful questions? Can you show us how this is up to work in Visual Studio Code? No, we're not going to do any setup questions. You can just watch the video back again after this, right? How is it possible? Interesting question about constants, const variables. Would you repeat when you would use a variable as let and when you would use a variable as const?
Yeah, absolutely. So most of the time I'm going to use const because when I create a variable, most of the time its value is not going to change, right? I just want something to hold some data that I'm going to use. Taking, for example, a pet, we'll call it Luna. I'm never going to change Luna's name. Luna's name is never going to change. So I can safely use a constant for this. Now, if I was going to take, if I was going to assign Luna to a specific vet, for example, that might change, right? I might take her to one vet and then decide I don't like that vet and I want to take her to a different one. In which case I would use let, okay? And I'll say Joe's pets, very inventive. This might change later. Okay, so I might do some stuff with Luna, and then later on in my code, I might want to update that variable. I might want to say, okay, I don't like Joe anymore. I want to take Luna to Mark's pets. These two are in direct competition with each other. So anytime that you think some data is going to change, you can use let. Anytime where the data is not going to change, you can use const. I would default to using const until you know for sure that you're going to change the value. So stick with const unless you feel like you're going to change the data at some point.
Cool. That sounds great.
Fantastic. Good questions. Okay, we've still got a bunch of stuff to go through and we're on 6 o'clock. So let's get moving.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just open up my next window. Conditions. Open up my dev tools. Here we go. This is where a little bit of a difficulty curve is going to come in. So we talked about Booleans a little bit earlier and how they're not too much use by themselves. Booleans usually result from us asking questions about our code. So we can say things like password is correct. That's going to be either true or false, right? Password correct, yes, no, true, false. So we can use something called if conditions or if statements or conditional flow, control flow. It goes by multiple names, right? It doesn't matter which one you use. So we can start constructing an if statement to control the flow of our application, right? If something is true or false, we want to do a specific thing. If the user entered their password correctly, we want to let them into the website. If they didn't, we want to send them away to Google or show them an error message. So we can construct an if statement by using this syntax. We use the word if, and then you want some opening and closing parentheses. And then after the closing parentheses, you want some opening and closing curly braces. I'm going to put these on new lines. So the opening curly brace, excuse me, is up here, and the closing curly brace is down here, just a couple of lines down. These curly braces represent a block of code that I want to run if some kind of condition is true. So a condition goes inside the parentheses. This is where true or false goes. If something is true, run this console log. So if something is true, run this block of code. Okay. So we head to our browser, we can see this console log right here. If we did if false and added this, added another console log in here, something is false, if we head back to the browser, we'll see that we don't get this in the console, right? We got the something is true, but we didn't get the something is false. So this is control flow. This is how we control the flow of our application. If something is true, run this block of code. If this is false, then do not run the block of code. And this will become a little bit clearer when we start asking questions. Usually, we do not put true or false directly into these parentheses. There's not much use in that. What we usually do is put some result of a condition, right? So we're going to ask our code questions. We're going to say, is my first name Nathan? If it is, console log out a message. So let's create a variable. I'm going to call it name, and I'm just going to say Nathan. Then I'm going to create an if statement. So I'm going to type if. I'm going to do some opening and closing parentheses, and then some opening and closing curly braces. I'm going to give myself some new line here. And the condition that I'm going to put in here, something needs to result in true or false. So the question I'm going to ask here is this variable Nathan? Does this variable contain the word Nathan? The way I can do that, I'm going to add a console log here, is by using another piece of syntax. So I can do the name of the variable, and then I'm going to do 3 equal signs. And then I'm going to put some value on the other side of it. What I'm saying here is this variable equal to this value? This right here is going to result in a true or a false. I've asked a question about my code. What have I done wrong here? It's this if statement. We get true. Name is Nathan. Okay. So I've asked a question. Is name Nathan? If I was to change this to say Jeff, I'm going to say, is name Jeff? Is name 3 equal signs Jeff? I'm going to get false. That's a false statement. Name is not Jeff, it's Nathan. So this is where we get true and false. So I can stick this question into my condition right here. Is name Nathan? And if it is, the code inside this code block is going to execute. My name is Nathan. And we get, hello, my name is Nathan. So we've created an if statement here. We've asked a question of our code. Is name Nathan? If it is, run this block of code. Okay. I'm going to add another if statement here and say name 3 equal signs and then Jeff. Is name Jeff? I'm going to console log my name is Jeff. But we don't get that in the console, right? We don't get hello, my name is Jeff in here because this comes out as false. Name is not Jeff, it's Nathan. We can do the opposite of this. So we can say, is something not equal to a value? So I can create another if statement here and I can say name. If my name is not equals to, let's go with Phil. If my name is not Phil, log something out. My name is not Phil. And that's because name is Nathan. So the syntax I use for this one is an exclamation mark followed by 2 equal signs. On the left-hand side, I have my variable name. The right-hand side, I have some value I want to compare the variable with. This results in a true or false value, and that true or false decides whether this code block should run. If it's true, it will run. If it's false, it'll just skip this. This will not run. We can do this with numbers as well. So we can say, is 5 more than 10? So I can use a right-facing chevron here, a right arrow. Is 5 more than 10? If it is, just console log out 5 is more than 10. I think we all kind of know that this is not going to display in the console because that statement is false. So I'm going to add another one here and say, is 5 less than 10? So this is the opposite arrow, okay? This is 5, left-facing chevron, 10. Is 5 less than 10? That's going to result in true or false. If it's true, the code inside of here is going to run. 5 is less than 10. And we get 5 is less than 10 in the console. Sometimes we want to do something, whether something is true or false. So we can do that by chaining on something new here. So I'm going to create a variable called color, and I'm going to set its value to red. Okay, so color is red. And what I'm going to say in here is color blue. If color is blue, run this code. So is color blue? This is going to come out as false. So this code is not going to run. We can see that in the browser. It's not there in the console. And then we can add another case here. So we can say, check if color is blue, and also provide another path for the code to go down. So we can use the word else here. After this closing curly brace, we can type the word else, lowercase, and then do some more opening and curly braces, opening and closing curly braces. This will act as a kind of switch. Okay, so it will say, is color blue? If it is, run this code. Otherwise, run whatever's in this else statement. Color is not blue. And now in our console, we'll see we get color is not blue. So just to go over that once more, we're saying is color blue? If it is, run this code right here. Else or otherwise, run this code. Okay, so if this is true, run this. If it's not true, run this. We have two paths in our code now. I think that's all I want to do for if-else statements. There is more to it, but I'm running kind of slim on time. So the next thing I want to look into before we stop again for some questions is something called loops. So let me just go through this rigmarole again. Open up my new page, open up my DevTools, look at my console, and I have my file. Sometimes we want to repeat a section of code multiple times, right? Maybe we want to console log counting to 100. So I'm going to console log 1, and then I'm going to console log 2, and I'm going to do this 100 times, right? No, that would be ridiculous. That would be absolutely ridiculous. So what I can do instead is I can write some code and tell it to repeat 100 times, rather than write it out 100 times myself. The syntax we use to do that is known as a loop. There are different types of loops. We're going to just focus on something called a for loop. So I'm going to write the word for, and this follows the same structure that an if statement does. So for, and then some opening and closing parentheses, and then some opening and closing curly braces. The code that repeats multiple times goes inside of the curly braces. So in here is where we want to log something. I'll stick a console log in here. And in these parentheses right here for the for loop, we need a few things, right? This gets a little bit more complex. This needs 3 things in order to function. It needs an initializer. It needs a condition, and it needs a finalizer. So these are in 3 parts. When the loop first begins, we need something usually to keep track of where our loop is, right? We want to know if we've ran 10 iterations of the loop or 20 or 100. We need to keep track of where our loop is in its current running condition. So we can do that, and this is where let comes in. we can define a variable in these parentheses. And you could call this whatever you like. You could call this count. You could call this an index. You could call this a number, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to call it index. And I'm going to start at 0. And then the second part of this, so I have a semicolon here to say this is my first part, and now I want my second part. The second part is the condition. The condition is what decides whether the loop should run, okay? So if index is less than 100, then I want my loop to run, okay? Then I have a semicolon, and then I have a finalizer. This is the last bit. This is the third bit of my loop. The finalization bit will run after every single iteration of the loop. So this first section will run when the loop begins, but only one time. This condition will run at the start of every iteration to check whether the loop should run for that iteration. And then the finalizer bit is something that we want to do after an iteration of the loop. And usually what we'll do is we'll increase this value. Okay, so we'll increase index by 1. We can do index equals index plus 1 to do this. And then inside the loop, we can repeat some code. So I'm just going to leave this as it is for now, console.log, and I'm just going to log out 1. And we're going to see that in the console, you won't see it on individual lines, but we can see 100 here. We've logged out 1 100 times. Okay, so I have some code repeating for 100 times. I've created some kind of variable to help me keep track of where my loop is. I've got a condition to say I want this loop to run while this variable is less than 100. And on my third bit here, I've created some kind of logic to increase this variable. So the loop is going to run, index is going to be 0. When the loop is finished running one time, it's going to increase index by 1. So index is then going to be 1. Index is less than 100, so the loop is going to run again. Index is going to increase by 1, and that's going to repeat until eventually index is going to be 100. The condition is going to say, is 100 less than 100? It's not, and then the loop stops running. So let me console log out the index so we can see this. And here we go. We count from 0 to 99. Without having to type out all of those console logs, right? So these are loops. This is how we can count. And since we can start at 0, and we know that arrays are 0 indexed, that means we can look at every item in an array. Right? That means we can traverse an array. We can look at arrays filled with 100,000 pieces of data without having to do specific things for each item. So if I have an array filled with 100 things, I want to perform some logic on every single one of those items, right? I don't want to have to write 100 blocks of code for every single item in that array. Instead, I can loop through it and perform a specific piece of logic. So I'm going to create an array here, and I'm going to call this hobbies. I'm going to use square brackets, and I'm going to put some things in here. So I'm going to say D&D. I'll say coding, coding, music, and errors. It's become a hobby at this point. We could imagine that we have 100 hobbies in this array, but we'll just stick with 4 for now. And if I want to console log all of these out without having to write 4 console logs, I can use a loop. So I can create another loop the same way I did before. So I'm going to use the for word, lowercase, opening and closing parentheses, then opening and closing curly braces. In these parentheses, I'm going to create my initializer. So I'm just going to call this one I, so I don't have to type out index. I can call this what I want. Could be banana if I wanted it to be. I'm just going to call it I. Oops. My condition is going to be I want my loop to run while I is less than the length of my hobbies array. So I can use hobbies.length. This is going to be 4. So we'll go 0, 1, 2, 3. 3 is less than 4, so that's fine. As soon as I reaches 4, that's it. And we've reached the end of the array. And then I can increase I by 1 each time after each iteration of the loop. Now up here, I did index equals index plus 1. There is a shorthand for this, which is 2 plus signs. So I can do I plus plus. What this does is just increase a number by 1. So if I is 3, plus plus will increase I to 4. It will increment something 1 time. Now I can add a console log in here, and I can log out my hobbies array, and I'm going to access an item by index. So I'm going to use square brackets here, and then I'm going to put a number in here. So I'm just going to log out the first item in this array, D&D, 4 times. But since we're looping with something called I, we've created a variable. We're going from 0, arrays are 0 indexed, and the loop is only going to run until we reach the end of the array. I can replace this 0 with my I variable, with my index variable. And now that's going to loop over the array and print out each of the things inside there. This is super useful. We use this all the time. So this is how we essentially look at a list of data and then do something with that data. That's a pretty tough subject. Let's pause briefly for a couple of questions before we move on to functions. Guessing there'll be some about the loops.
Hello. Lots of questions, and then you then explain. So they were lots of people are already thinking and trying to read about what you're talking about, and they have a question, and then you answer it anyway. So we have a number of questions like this, which is really good to see. A question about the second expression in the for loop there about less than, and trying to sort of read about on line 4. Why do you use 100, not 101 to get to 100? And maybe you can spend a second talking about why we, given that we start at 0 index, why we do that.
Absolutely, yeah. So we're going to start at 0, right? The first index that we log out is going to be 0. The reason I've started at 0 is just because most things in programming languages are indexed from 0 instead of starting at 1. And I want this loop to run 100 times. So if we look at the bottom of our log here, we'll see that we get 99, right? So we've gone from 0 to 99, which technically is 100 logs. This condition here is saying, make my loop run as long as this index is less than 100. So when index is 99, this is going to come out as true, and the loop's going to run again, and then it's going to increase index to 100. Then it's going to look at the condition and say, is 100 less than 100? No, it's not. The loop is finished. The only reason I'm starting at 0 is just for this situation down here. Most of the time, we will start a loop with a 0 index, just so we can traverse an array, so we can move through an array using an index.
Cool. If you have multiple variables, is the first one always valued at 0? I think this question it might be to do with the index variable when you start off at 0.
Okay. So if I, for example, were to change this to index.
Potentially.
Have 2 of these.
Let's maybe go with the slightly easier one. Is like, does it always have to be 0 to start off in a for loop?
No, you can start wherever you'd like to start from. So I'm going to start this one at 80, for example. I'm going to console log this one out. And I'm going to scroll up my logs, and I'll see that I've started the loop at 80 and I've ended at 99. So you can start from whatever you like. You can start from a minus number if you want to. You can start and end wherever you like.
Nice. It keeps crashing someone's browser. Do you know why that might be, Nathan?
Likely you have an infinite loop, which means that your condition is never evaluating to false. Right, so I would check things like make sure you have a less than sign instead of a greater than sign. You need to make sure that this condition eventually at some point will evaluate to false. It could be that you're not incrementing the index. It could be any number of things, but that's probably the issue there.
Yeah. That's it for questions.
Nice, fantastic. Let's move on to functions. How are we doing for time?
We're at 6:25.
Okay. Yeah, we'll be okay, hopefully. This might be a bit of a crash course. Okay, so we're going to touch on something called functions, which are very useful. So we've talked about loops being able to repeat a bit of code as many times as we wanted to. Maybe also we don't want to repeat ourselves when we're writing logic. Okay, so maybe we've written 10, 15, 20 lines of code, and we want to use that code again in a different application or in a different part of our application, in a different file, maybe in the same file, but later on. And we don't want to rewrite the same 15 lines over and over and over again. We can use something called a function. Like a variable is a container for a value, a function is a container for a piece of logic. So we can put some instructions into a box, and we can put the box over there somewhere. And when we want to perform that piece of logic, we get the box out, we run it, then we put it back. So we never need to come up with those instructions again. They're just there waiting for us. So we can create a function by using the keyword function. If you haven't guessed, a lot of these are quite intuitive with the way they're named. So we'll use the keyword function, then a space, and then you give your function a name. So I'm going to create a function that just logs out hello world. I'm going to call this function say hello. So I've got the name of my function, which could be anything I want it to be, banana, whatever. Then I've got some opening and closing parentheses. And then I've got some opening and closing curly braces. You'll notice a theme here. Blocks of code are usually indicated by opening and closing curly braces. And pretty much everything we've been through has opening and closing parentheses. If statements, for loops, functions, there are some other stuff as well. Inside these opening and closing curly braces is where I put my logic. Okay, so maybe I create a variable in here called message, and that's just going to be hello world. And then underneath that, I console log that message. Okay, so I've created a function here. Inside the curly braces, I have this piece of logic, 2 lines of code. I've created a variable, and I've console logged that variable out. If I then go to my browser, open my console, ooh, I don't see anything. It's not there. My code's not running. Fear not. Just because we've created the logic, we've put it into a box ready for use later. Okay, so everything is prepared. It's there for us. It's ready to be used when we want to use it. It doesn't actually run, though. We need to tell it when we want it to run. So to do that, we just use the name of the function that we created. I called this one say hello, could be named whatever we want. And I'm going to use opening and closing parentheses. I'm going to save my file, and then I get my hello world. Now this means I don't need to write these 2 lines every time I want to run this piece of logic. Okay, so I can just call say hello as many times as I want to. I'm going to run it 3 times, and I'm going to get it 3 times in the console. So I can package logic into a function for use later. So for example, I could create a function that looks at every item in an array and then does something with every single item. And maybe I want to reuse that function in various different parts of my code. It's a bit of a complex example, but that's kind of why they're useful. That's why we use them. Now I'm going to create another function here, and I'm going to call this one greet. And this is going to do pretty much the same thing. It's going to console log, but it's going to greet somebody. Okay, it's going to say hello and then somebody's name. If I then run this function, so I'm going to call greet, Hello, Nathan. Great, it works. It's not particularly useful though. This function is only ever useful for greeting Nathan. What if I want to greet somebody else? Right? What if Ed walks in and I want to greet Ed? Am I going to say, hi, Nathan? No, that would be dumb. So what I can do instead is I can tell my function to use a value that I give it inside of its logic, right? So kind of like creating a variable for a function. So in these parentheses where I've created the function, I can define some parameters. We call them parameters. You can think of them like variables for the function, if that makes things easier. And we do the same thing. So we come up with a name for the variable, a name for the parameter. And we just put that between these parentheses here. What that means is now I can concatenate this onto my message. I can say console.log hello, and then whatever is contained in this parameter right here is what gets logged out to the screen. Now I'm going to look at this in the browser and I'm going to get hello undefined. Not quite what we want. That's because when I'm calling the function here, I'm running the function, I need to give that name parameter some value to use. Okay, so I need to give it something that it can put into this name parameter so the function can use that. I can do this just like we've been doing so far with console.log. Console.log is a function, and we've been giving it a value to log out to the console. We can do the same thing here. I can give my function some value to put into this parameter. I can say Nathan. And when I run this function now, this is going to put this Nathan value into this parameter, into this variable. So my function now can use that value. And I get hello, Nathan. What this means is now I have a repeatable piece of code. I have a greeter function that I can use for as many different people as I want to. Hello, Nathan. Hello, Ed. Hello, Josh. I've used the same piece of logic, and I've used a parameter for my function. So depending on what I give it, different things will happen. I can do multiple parameters. I think I'm just going to kind of brush over this one. Mm-hmm. I can create a function to add two numbers together, for example. So I'm going to create a function called sum. I'm going to give this one 2 parameters. I'm going to say number 1, number 2. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm not going to use console log. I'm going to use something else. I'm going to use a new word here called return. And what return does is essentially tells my function to give me back something. It tells my function to give me some kind of value. It doesn't print it to the console. It just gives me a value to use. So what I can do here is I can do number 1 plus number 2. I'm using the word return, and we'll look into a little bit why this is doing what it's doing. But what I can essentially do here is run my function and give it 2 values. So I'll say 5 and 10. I want to add 5 and 10 together. I'm going to look in my console and I'm not going to get anything because we haven't added any console logs. So what this function is doing is it's running some logic. It's adding number 1 and number 2 together, and then it's returning that value back to me, right? It's giving me that value back. I can save that value into my own little variable here. I can create a variable called whatever I want. I'm going to call this result. The value of this result variable is going to be whatever sum gives me back, whatever sum returns to me. It's returning to me number 1 plus number 2. I'm giving it 5 to put into the number 1 parameter and 10 to put into the number 2 parameter. And now I can console log out that result. And I get 15. Small crash course on return there. We also need to talk about passing functions to functions, but I think we can do that when we get to array functions, which is next up. So let me just dip into the next one. Then we'll have a brief stop for questions before we get into some browser manipulation. Let me bring up my new file here. Okay, so we've talked about arrays and we've talked about functions, and we can use them together. So I'm just going to create a new array here called names, and that's going to have myself. It's going to have Ed. We're going to have Patrick, someone called Andy, and let's go with Lewis. And I'm just going to console log out these names. And we see them in the console here as they are written: Nathan, Ed, Patrick, Andy, and Lewis. Now, I might want to sort this array by alphabetical order, right? I may want Andy to come first. Arrays give us a bunch of functions built in under the hood, right? So we can call functions on an array, just like we do with console.log. We're calling the log function on the console object. We can take our names array and we can call a sort function on it. So an array has a function attached to it called sort. So we can call this in the same way we do console.log. We can do the name of our array and then sort, names.sort, and then some opening and closing parentheses. And then I'm going to console log out my names array again. And we'll see we've got the original array here. And then after I've called the sort function, it's put them into alphabetical order. So this is why functions are very useful to be reused. Imagine having to write out all of the functionality to sort an array alphabetically every single time you wanted to do it. There are some other things we can do with this. So say we wanted to add a person to the end of our array. We can do names, which is just the name of our variable, names. And then we can call push. So push is a function that adds something onto the end of an array. Okay, I can say James. Then I'm going to console log out my names array. And we'll see now we've got a new array here. We've got the original array as it was, and then it's sorted on the next line. And then it's still sorted on the next line, and we've added James to the end. So we've added something to the end of our array by calling push and giving it something to add. If we want to then remove something from the end of our array, we can use a different function called pop. We want to pop something off the end of our array. And then I can console log names. And we end up with the array we had before. James was put into it, and then we popped, and James was taken away. Few more functions we need to look at here. So we may want to change the data inside of an array. Maybe we want a version of the array where every name has been changed to uppercase, right? So maybe everything is in uppercase characters. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a function that can do that for me. I'm going to create a function. I'm going to call it make uppercase. I'm going to add some parentheses here and then my opening and closing curly braces. And then I'm going to need something to transform. So I'm going to need some parameter, something that I want to change to uppercase. So I'm going to say name. And then I'm going to return. So I want to return back a value. You've given me a value. You've given me name. And I'm going to return back to you name with some changes. I'm going to go name and then to uppercase. Name dot to uppercase. So I'm calling a function called to uppercase on this name string, on this name parameter. Now what I can actually do with this is I can give this function to another function, and that function can use it. Kind of functionception going on there. So if I want to run this function on every single item in my array, I can do that with an array method, an array function called map. So I can do names.map. This is a map function. And I'm going to give it my make uppercase function. Okay, I'm going to tell my map function that I want it to run this make uppercase function on every single item in my array. This is where things get kind of complex. This is going to run this make uppercase function on every single name inside of this names array. So it's going to change Nathan to uppercase. It's going to change Ed to uppercase. Now, this is not going to modify the original array. The map function is going to return to me a brand new array with the changes made. So I'm going to need to save this into a new variable. I'm going to call it updated names. And then I'm going to console log out my updated names variable. And then we see we have a new array here, and all of the names have been changed to uppercase. Pretty tricky, this stuff. Don't expect to have an in-depth knowledge of this after 2 minutes. There's a couple of others that we want to run through. We can use another function on our array called sum. So sum is also going to take in a function, and our function is going to run on every single item in the array. And depending on what our function returns, sum is going to use this. If our function that we give to sum ever returns true, then the sum function is going to return true. So essentially what we use the sum function for is to check whether at least one thing in our array matches a specific condition. If we want to check, for example, that at least one of the names in our array is at least 5 characters long, then we can use the sum function. So I'm going to create a function down here called check 5 cars, for example. And I'm just going to return name is greater than, name.length is greater than 5. I'm going to give this to my sum function, check 5 cars. And I'm just going to save this into a variable called result. And I'm going to console log this out, just so we can see what's going on here. So the sum function is going to run my check 5 chars function on every single item. This function is going to get the current name it's looking at, get its length, and then check whether it's greater than 5, and return that the result of that evaluation. It's going to return true or false. So every single item, it's going to run this function. It's going to say true or false. If it ever returns true on any of the names, this result variable will contain true. Okay, we'll see that here. If we change this to a ridiculous value, name length is greater than 500, none of the names are greater than 500 characters, so we get false. Similarly to sum, we have another one. I'm just going to copy paste this code because it's only one change I need to make. We have a function called every, which does the same thing as the sum function, but it checks every single item, and every single item has to match for this result2 variable to contain true. Every single item has to match. So every single name in the array has to be longer than 5. Otherwise, we get false. I'm going to change this to 1, and we get true. Kind of sped through that one, but we're kind of running short on time here. Shall we stop for any questions, Ed, or should we just power on?
Quick question. How do you comment a whole block of code rather than just line by line?
Really good question. So what you can do is you can just hold your left click on your mouse and just drag and select everything that you want to comment out. And if you're on Windows, you hold Control. If you're on Mac, you hold down Command, and then you press the / key, and that will comment all of that stuff out. If you hold Control or Command and press the / key again, that will uncomment everything out. Really good question.
Another question, in the make uppercase function that you've written, what exactly is performing the uppercase transformation?
So that is a function attached to a string. So every single string has a bunch of functions attached to it. So I can say, for example, Nathan dot to uppercase. We also have a to lowercase. Let me just show that out. Let's transform my string to lowercase, transformed it to uppercase. So it's just a function that's attached to a string, right? Just like arrays have functions attached to them as well.
Nice.
Okay. Let's get into some HTML.
Nice.
That you've all been waiting for. So I'm just going to copy over my HTML. You guys already have this, so don't worry. There is one more line that I've added in here. Okay, so I have this, this new tag that I've put in here, just like Ed showed yesterday, to pull in a style sheet for this HTML document. So let me send this to Ed so he can send it out if need be. Okay. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to create a HTML element. So just the same way Ed did this kind of stuff yesterday, I'm going to create a div. And I'm going to give this div a class. And I'm going to call this class hello. Inside the opening and closing tag here, I'm just going to write the words hello world, sticking with tradition. So I've got some HTML. I'm going to open up my browser. And I'm going to see right in the top left-hand corner here, the words hello world. Fantastic. I've created a website ready to go live. Over in my index.js file, so we'll see in the HTML file, we have this line right here. We're importing a script file. We're importing index.js. This is our JavaScript file. What we can do in here is we can pull in that HTML element so we can make some changes with it, right? So we can create a new constant. We can create a new variable. I'm going to call this hello div. The value of this variable, I want to be this HTML element so that I can make some changes to it, okay? The way I'm going to do that is by using document. So the word document, all lowercase, dot, and then using a function called query selector. A query is in lowercase, selector has a capital S. We call this camel casing. We're not going to go too much into casing, but lowercase q on query, uppercase S on selector. We're going to give our query selector a parameter to use. We're going to give it a CSS class that we want to target. So if we look at our HTML here, we gave our div a class of hello. So in our index.js, we can pass into our query selector function .hello. So this is the same way that you create classes in your CSS file. You use a dot and then the name of the class you want to make. What I'm going to do here is just console log this out. Console log out my hello div, and I'll see I've got this big old thing in my console. This is all of the things that are attached to that HTML element that are under the hood that we can't see. But we can now make some changes, okay? So what I can do here is I can change the words, okay? So in the HTML document, I've written hello world, and I can tell JavaScript that I want to change that, okay? I want to do hello div dot inner text. So inner is all lowercase, text has a capital T. And I'm going to say some new value. Goodbye world. This hello div is now a JavaScript object when we've pulled it in. That JavaScript object has an inner text property or attribute, and I'm assigning it a brand new value. And then we're going to see in the browser when it runs, the text changes to goodbye world. It's very small though, so let's start adding some styling to change things a little bit. So I'm going to add some CSS to my CSS file. I'm just going to add 4 classes. I'm going to create a class called red, and I'm going to make the color red. I'm going to create a class called big, and I'm going to make the font size 200 pixels. I'm going to create another class called font. I'm going to set the font family, font family to Arial. And then I'm going to create another one called bold, where I'm going to set the font weight to, let's go crazy and say 900. So just some simple CSS right here. Don't worry too much about copying all of this in. You can come up with your own classes as well if you want to. Now, I'm not going to add these classes to my div directly, okay? I'm not going to add it directly in the HTML. So even though I've created the CSS classes, the div is still the same, okay? What I'm going to do is I'm going to add these classes to my div through code, okay? So I can take my hello div object. This object has something called a class list. Okay, this is a list of all of the CSS classes it has, an array of strings. You see how these are kind of coming into play now. This class list has a function on it called add, and I can tell it to add a specific CSS class that I want. So if I want to add one of my CSS classes here, let's say I want to make it big, I'm going to add the big class. And I'm going to go and have a look at my code, and now, wow, it's massive. It's huge. Brilliant. I can do the same thing for my other classes. I can add any class that I want. So hello div.classlist.add red. And we make the text red. Exciting stuff now. Now we're getting into the good stuff. Let's add the other two. So hello div.classlist.add font. And hello div.classlist.add, what was it? Bold. We called it goodbye world in Arial, red, bold, gigantic. If I want to remove one of these classes, I can do hello div.classlist and then call the remove function. And I want to tell it which class I want to remove. Maybe I don't want the red anymore. I can do that. Get rid of the red. Cool. So we've added a bunch of big red text on the screen. I'll just comment this out. What I want to do now is create a list of things. Try and run through this real quick. So I'm going to create an unordered list element. I'm going to give this a class of list. And inside this unordered list element, I want to add a bunch of li elements. Okay. I want to add a bunch of these. I don't want to do it manually. Don't want to do it in the CSS. Maybe I want to get a JavaScript array, and for every single thing in that array, create an li element. Okay, so maybe I have a constant called names, where I have Nathan, I have Ed, I have Patrick. And then we'll just skim through this. So I'm going to create an array. I'm just going to power code this. I'm going to go for I less than names.length, I++. Essentially, I'm just creating a loop that will loop through and look at every item in this array. Then for every single item, I want to create a brand new list item. Okay, so I'm creating this in code based on an array of data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my unordered list HTML class element. We'll just call that UL. I'm going to use document.querySelector like I have at the top of the file. So document.querySelector. Oh. And I want to target the class of list. So I gave it a class of list. And we'll need the dot on there. And essentially what I want to do is append a bunch of list item elements onto this UL, okay, onto this unordered list. So what I'm going to do is inside my loop, I'm going to create a brand new list item. And to do that, I'm going to do document.createElement. Apologies for the pop-ups. Document.createElement, then some opening and closing parentheses. And the element that I want to create is an li, okay? So this is the HTML element that I want. I want to create a list item element. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to add list item dot inner text. I'm going to add some inner text to this list item, and I'm just going to say the value of that is going to be names I, so the current name that I'm looking at in the loop. I'm going to add a class to it. I'm going to say list item dot class list dot add. I'm just going to make everything red. And then the next thing I want to do is I want to append this item onto my list. Okay, so I want to do my UL element, my unordered list. I want to call the append function to it. And I'm just going to add this list item element onto it. Okay, and let's go and have a look at what that looks like. Really small, but you can see it down here. Nathan, Ed, and Patrick. Let me just make this big. Nathan, Ed, Patrick. If we look at the HTML inside of here, we'll see that the JavaScript has created each of these elements for me, right? I've coded this up instead of doing it straight in the HTML. I think probably want to cover one more thing, Ed, and then I think you can probably take the timeout and set interval when you get to it during the project.
That sounds great.
Cool. Okay. So we have one more thing that I want to go through. And that is how to handle clicking on things, how to handle when a user clicks on things. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to really quickly open up my next page here. Open up my next file, my index, my JS. I've already got the style. And what I'm going to do in this HTML file is I'm going to add my div in here again. So div with a class of hello. I'm going to say hello world. I'm going to make it big, red, bold, and I'm going to change the font. So these are all of my CSS styles I've added. And I'm just going to have a look at this, and I've got hello world on my page here. And the next thing I want to do is I want to create a button. So I'm going to create a button element. I'm going to give it an ID, and I'm going to just call it BTN. And the text I want to display on the button is just click me. Okay. So right at the top here, I have a button that says click me. Nothing happens yet. Nothing's happening. So what I want to do in my index.js file is I want to create some functionality for when this button gets clicked. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to pull my button into my JavaScript file. So I'm going to create a variable called button. The value is going to be document.querySelector. Now, this time I used an ID on the HTML element and not a class. So in this case, instead of a dot, I'm going to have to use a hashtag. And that was BTN. And then I want to run some piece of logic when I click on this button. Okay, so I'm going to create a function that's going to run whenever I click on this button. If I didn't create a function, if I just wrote the code in this file without doing it in a function, this file would just run by default. And I don't want that to happen. I just want the function to run when the button gets clicked. So I'm going to create a function, and I'm going to call it change style. So I'm going to call it change style with some opening and closing parentheses, some opening and closing curly braces. Inside this function, I want to change the style of this text right here. I want to maybe make it black, make it smaller. We'll see. So what I'm going to do in this function is create a new constant, get my hello div, so document.querySelector. And that's going to be the hello element by the hello class. And what I want this function to do is just go hello div, give me your class list and remove the red. Hello div, give me your class list and remove the font. Change the font. The next thing I want to do is I want to attach this function to my button. Okay, so when the button actually gets clicked, the function will run. So what we need to do is we need to grab our button. I'm going to do dot, and then I'm going to use a function on here called add event listener. Okay, this is called add event listener, capital E, capital L, but a lowercase a, camel cased. Add event listener. This takes two parameters. The first parameter is a string, which is some information about what the event is that happened. So in this case, when a user clicks on the button, when the button is clicked, I'm going to say click. I want to run my change style function. Okay, so I'm going to listen for a click event. When the button gets clicked, run this function. And we're going to see this in the code now. When I click the button and it changes my text. How cool is that?
Nice.
Ready
World's
to go.
best website.
Yeah, I'm going to send this into Google. Let's go for questions. We're on 2 minutes past 7. We went over time. Sorry about that.
No worries, no worries. Fantastic job taking us through this, Nathan. Really nice. I was able just to listen to you. You have such a calm, soothing voice.
Really?
Amazing. Really. It was lovely to have you in my ear. Hopefully, as everyone else. Instead of questions, let's do a couple of things. Well, I'm going to hand over to Patrick to wrap up. And the other thing I want to do before we wrap up is, for all of you still wanting to play around with the work that we've been doing today, if you haven't yet joined the Discord community server for Boolean, please do so, because then you can chat to each other and help each other out debugging some of your work. Coding is a very social, fun activity to do together, and you'll be able to more quickly see the errors in your code and help each other out. And you'll also be able to potentially interact with some of the teaching teams as well if we have a spare minute. So if you haven't yet, please join the Discord community server, and you can share some of the things that you're stuck on and help each other out, and we can help you as well. But otherwise, Nathan, what a fantastic job, and I'm looking forward to tomorrow's session even more now. Patrick, over to you.
Yeah, I definitely just want to echo a huge thank you, Nathan. You absolutely smashed it. Super interesting. Also, Ed, for those quick fire question answers. I think that must be a record of most questions answered in such a short space of time.
334.
334, not bad. Not bad at all. And thank you to all of you for participating, for your questions, for your interest. It's been super great to have you here. A few things just to wrap up on attendance. So we've shared the form a couple of times now in the chat. If you haven't got that, maybe we can just share that one more time quickly. Fill that one in today. As we said, don't worry about if you weren't able to make it tomorrow, and if you didn't fill in the form in yesterday, we're not going to count that for the certificate, because not everyone was able to attend because of the max capacity problem that we had. Recordings are going to be made available of all sessions the following day, so this one will be available. It should be around lunchtime, early afternoon. Feel free to kind of re-watch this stuff. We know this went quite quick. We know that there was probably parts that you felt a bit lost in. So re-watch it, pause it, take it at your own pace, play around with the stuff, break it, fix it again. That's kind of all part of the process too. And just kind of a note on keeping up. Also for later sessions, you know, this might generally feel like it's difficult to keep up, but you know, don't worry. Most of this is just about showing you, look at all this cool stuff that you can do. And if you come and join us on our full-time course, we're going to go through this at a much more manageable pace, and we're able to give much more kind of one-to-one support, particularly in the afternoon sessions, where on a class of 20, 25 students compared to a Zoom of I think we had over 1,000 at our peak today. So it's a lot more difficult to get through to everyone's questions. And also just a note on that, sorry if we didn't get to your question, we do try to get to as many of them as possible. It's really hard to do the setup ones if there's something specific going wrong on your machine, because we need to see screenshots and all of that kind of stuff, and it gets really messy and really tricky. So in those cases, we apologize, but hopefully watching the recording back tomorrow, you'll be able to have a second go at it. I think that's probably everything I had to say. And other than that, just a huge thank you again to Nathan, a big thank you again to Ed, and thank you to everyone for joining us. We cannot wait to see you for tomorrow for the project, first project, Tic-tac-toe. Looking forward to that one. So it's 5 o'clock, same Zoom link. And yeah, looking forward to it. Enjoy the rest of your evenings, everybody. We'll see you all soon.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.